Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Iowa Mennonite Historical Meeting. Thank you all for coming. If some of you came last night, I apologize that we changed the schedule and you might not have found out. We kind of decided about a week ago to do this, but it was too late to get it in the newspaper, so we might have missed the announcement. But thank you for coming tonight. First, we'll do a little business for our Historical Society. Gloria's back there and she can collect membership dues, and we have apple butter for sale, $6 for a pint, $3.50 for half a pint. If you take all that's there and you want more, we can get you more, so help yourselves. We would encourage, if you're not a member of this society, we'd certainly encourage anyone to become a member. $25 gets as a family membership for a year, and that's quite a bargain these days, I think. An individual, if you want just one, it's $20. As a matter of business, we did have Ruby Miller decide she did not want to be part of our board anymore, and I want to express great appreciation for her time on the board. She did a wonderful job for us. Carolyn Detweiler has agreed to be a board member pending membership approval, so at this time I would say all members that are in favor of Carolyn Detweiler being our board member, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you very much. Our speaker for our evening is Michael Zahs. You probably all know him. He's been in the community for a long time as a long-time teacher in the Washington school system. He grew up on a farm in Iowa and has had a long interest in history. And although he didn't teach lots of history, he did teach some, and the reports are that his history classes were quite interesting. He's quoted as saying that we study history because it's the story of people that lived, not necessarily the people that died. So how they died wasn't so important as how they lived. He's known as having the largest collection of Christmas nativities, and you may have seen his Christmas nativities down at Washington at the Hills Bank a year or so ago. He's been known for finding old films, the Brinton films from Washington, and that documentary film has been made about that story, Saving Brinton. We're very pleased that Michael agreed to give us a presentation tonight about agriculture in this community back in the beginning when people came and subsequently. So, Michael?
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Then I need to talk softer then. But if for some reason you can't hear me, let me know. I didn't know why I accepted this because it was a topic I had never talked on before, which means I had to do work. And if the topic is Amish and Mennonite agricultural innovations, Shouldn't some of you be doing this rather than me? I would think so. So you're all just sitting there ready to correct me at any move. So I'm going to maybe do a little bit more on the history before we came here than was expected, but it's very important to get the background of the innovations that occurred before Amish and Mennonite came here. And I'll probably be referring to Amish and Mennonite just as one group. Iowa Amish, and we can count Old Order Amish better than we can count Mennonites. Mennonites are just kind of slick and we can't always count them. But there are 10,205 Old Order Amish in Iowa. We are the 9th most populous state for Old Order Amish in the U.S. There are 377,275 Amish in the United States. It doubles every 20 years. The fastest growing minority within the United States are the Amish. Johnson and Washington counties together have 11 Amish church districts with 1,935 people in these two counties. That number has doubled since the year 2000. Amish are in 32 states, 4 provinces, several Central American countries, and 2 South American countries, Bolivia and Argentina. And I think there used to be in Uruguay. There are only 4 Old Order Amish settlements in the New World that are older than the settlement that we're in right here today. The 4 that are oldest, this Washington Johnson County settlement started in 1846, before Iowa was a state. Older settlements are in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Ontario. Since I retired from teaching 15 years ago, people seem to think I have nothing to do, which isn't true. But I do sometimes enjoy doing programs, and this was one that was fun for me to look into. My Amish ancestors left the Amish church and became Quakers years ago. But at that time, there was almost no difference between Quaker and Amish. And one of my Quaker cousins from West Branch became president. Amish and Mennonite farmers have made most of the farming innovations made in the world since the 1700s. Almost all of them can be traced to Amish and Mennonite. So your farming innovations are because of your religion. I'll explain that. The Catholic Church largely controlled Western Europe. Catholics were not tolerant of other beliefs, especially not tolerant of Protestants and Anabaptists. They were particularly nasty to Anabaptists and Protestants to the point where they were sometimes even killing them. When the Anabaptist movement began, the Catholic leaders put great pressure on the Anabaptists. Catholics were the state church of most of Western Europe, Central and Western Europe, which meant that if you were born in Germany, you were Catholic. You were required to be baptized within the Catholic Church. And Menno Simons and Jacob Ammon were not in favor of that, even though they both had been Catholic priests. The Mennonites began in the middle 1500s, the Amish in the late 1600s. And you know all of this, I'm sure. But I'm just reviewing. Most people at that time were subsistence farmers. And what that meant was they grew enough for their family and that was all. They did not grow to sell and make a profit. And it wasn't that they wouldn't have liked to, it just wasn't possible. Almost all farmers, particularly in Germany, but other countries as well, lived in villages and worked land outside the villages. They came back to the village at night. Again, mostly subsistence farming. The Catholic Church and the state began not to allow Amish and Mennonite Anabaptists to own land. They made it a law that they could not own land. Then they made it a rule that they could not rent land. So if you are a farmer and you can't get land, you have a problem. Again, this is where religion comes into farming. Anabaptists felt that this was wrong and they left the persecution and they were forced to go to marginal land, land that was not presently farmed because it wasn't good. Most farmers lived in like I said, lived in a village, were very tight in that village. They all farmed alike and they shared what they knew about farming there. Well, Mennonites, Mennonites and Amish, one of the best things that they do is they communicate. And they learn from each other. Well, what the Catholics did, they wanted to spread them out so they couldn't communicate as well. And they did. So the Amish and the Mennonites were forced into marginal land, largely in Switzerland, higher up in the mountains. They had large families, but they needed large families to support the family. Communication was very, very important, and without that, most of these farming innovations would not have happened. So they were put on land that had never been farmed, was not good land, but they had to make a living on it. They learned from each other and from people in other places that if you added lime and gypsum to these marginal soils and you did something that we think surely was done, but it wasn't, they hauled manure. So Amish and Mennonite, if you have that background, you were the first manure haulers in the world. And that's significant. That's very significant. This marginal soil was better in just a few years. If you add lime to soil, that's calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate, and it neutralizes acidity in the soil. Gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, helps plants absorb nutrients. Okay, those two, lime and gypsum, are all from the sea. Most of them are made from long, long ago coral. And so the Anabaptists learned to grind these and spread them on the soil, and then by adding manure, they made in just a few years land that was not productive. In the villages where they came from, the only thing that they did to improve the farming was that every third year you didn't farm that field. The field was left fallow for 1 year. Well, that helped, but it didn't improve the soil a great deal. So the Anabaptist farmers, by adding manure, lime, and gypsum, could use every field every year. Manure improved the soil. And what the Amish and Mennonites did was they collected lots of manure. In the villages, the cattle were allowed to roam all winter outside. They had to forage for themselves. The Anabaptists built barns and confined the animals in the wintertime. They found that they didn't eat as much food, they produced more manure, and it was a win-win situation. So outside the barns, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, they would have a fenced-in area where they would collect the manure from the barns and put it in there and let it start to deteriorate so that it could be spread in the fields. Something that other farmers also did not do at this time, besides confining their animals, they did nothing to improve pastures. Animals just went out and foraged for what they could. Well, the Amish and Mennonites learned that if you fertilized pastures with lime and gypsum and manure, that you had so much that you could cut hay and have food for feeding the animals that were in the barns all winter. And I don't know exactly how this happened, but in 1737, one of the farmers found a plant in France called clover. This had not been used in Germany, so they started planting clover. Clover adds nitrogen to the soil, greatly improves the soil again. And if you feed cattle fodder that has clover, that has been raised on land that they have fertilized, you got 2/3 more milk and cheese than the people who didn't do that. That's a big deal. So if you were used to getting a gallon of milk, you're suddenly getting 3 gallons of milk. They also dug drainage ditches and encouraged the water to go through their pastures rather than just running down the mountainsides in Switzerland. So they improved meadows tremendously. And other people almost never did that in Germany. Okay, then the thing that we still do, they developed crop rotation. Now all of this sounds like, why didn't other people think of it? They just weren't as smart as us. So rather than let land be fallow, in the 1700s, they started rotating crops. And it depended on where they were, what crops they could rotate. But they would use some kind of grain. Could be spelt wheat, could be rye, different grains. Not corn. Corn was not, did not grow where they were forced to live. They grew flax, root vegetables, and clover. They also improved the quality of their cattle. So if somebody had a couple cows that gave a lot more milk or gave a lot more meat, they discussed that with other people in other places and shared those animals. They learned from each other. Or back in Germany, if you had a new idea, that didn't work in your village. Everybody had to farm the same. And if you said, okay, I'm going to plant clover, they knew we're not doing that. And that's really what happened. And then, I thought this was interesting, they not only used fodder, hay, which in Germany they weren't making hay, and they made hay up in the mountains, but also, if they didn't have enough hay, they fed their animals beets and potatoes. So I don't know if that made pink milk or what, I don't know, but they were doing that in the late 1700s. And then something that suddenly came out just a few years ago as a great new idea, and that was to take what is left over from breweries and feed it to cattle. Amish and Mennonites were doing that in the 1700s. I don't know that they participated in what made that distilling product, but it was just wasted. And they started using it and again improved their cattle. So better breeds of cattle, excellent pasture, and excessive cleanliness. I don't know whether we can be said to be excessively cleanliness now, but that was keeping the barns immaculate and removing the waste outside of the barn. And again, they shared all this, learned from each other. Okay, so farming was considered a sacred occupation. I don't know if we consider much sacred anymore, but that was one of the reasons that so much was put into farming. It was a sacred occupation. They had respect for the land. It was a gift from God. So when I said that innovations of farming was because of religion, it was. Rotating crops also did something else besides just improve the soil. It diminished disease. So if you had potatoes in this field one year and you planted potatoes there again and there was a disease got in there, it stayed, but you switched. You didn't plant them in the same place, and that killed out insects, it killed out viruses. And you know, we do it today like it's a new idea. Just sit up real straight and think, we thought of that. And they didn't use chemicals because they didn't need to as much. No hormones in the feeds or antibiotics. It was very naturally sustainable. Okay, who brought the Amish and Mennonites to the United States?
William Penn.
Good, one person knew that. William Penn. William Penn, of course, was settling in Pennsylvania. He needed more settlers, and so he picked the best farmers in the world and brought the Amish and Mennonite to Pennsylvania. And there are no Amish in Europe. There haven't been since the 1800s. They brought their innovations with them. Here, crop rotation was different because they didn't have to farm in the high altitude. And the soil was better. They didn't have to, by improving the soil here, they had amazing soil. They had different crops. They could grow oats, different kinds of wheat, and corn. Okay, I'm going to jump around a little bit here, and I realize that. Okay, Iowa was open for settlement in the early 1830s. Amish and Mennonites were in Johnson and Washington County in the 1840s, before Iowa was a state. And I said that before. And I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to anyway. My first ancestor in Iowa was in 1808. And he helped build Fort Madison. And was killed there in the War of 1812. And took my students down there a number of years ago. We found his grave, and it is now a national cemetery. But there was such great expanses of fertile soil that they weren't used to it, and they started making huge profits. And I don't know whether this came down in your family, but there suddenly became very rich Mennonites and Amish because they were used to working so hard to get just barely enough, and here they could get a lot. Okay, this study was done much later, but I like this. Oberlin College did a study on farm ground that is worked with horses. The study found that the soil, which was worked with horses, absorbed 7 times more water before saturation than conventional farming. Is that important? It certainly is. Also, working with horses greatly enhanced wildlife and birds. And one of the things you have time if you're working with horses is to enjoy wildlife and birds. You never hear a bird if you're in a tractor with a cab on it and playing CDs, or I don't know what goes on in there. I grew up on a farm. We never had a cab on anything. But one Amish farm David Klein is one of my favorite authors, and he's an Amish person from Ohio. And he keeps track of the birds he sees on his farm. And they said within 200 feet of their house, there were 1,800 baby birds. I would guess in Iowa you could have a square mile and not have that many birds. Also, workhorses rested over noon, and they don't work after dark. It was easier on the farmers. You know, when my wife and I got married, the field across the road from our house, I think I had lived there maybe 10 or 15 years before I ever saw anything done in that field in the daytime. It was always done at night. So, were they watching birds? Probably plowing them out. But working with horses is just a different pace and more of a connection with nature. And here is a quote from David Klein that I just referred to. He's an old order Amish bishop in Ohio. Do I farm to make a living, or whether it is a front, just an excuse to be out in the field looking at clouds and birds? Isn't that neat? I like that. Okay, so when the Anabaptists got to the Midwest, great expanses of fertile land, they weren't used to it so much. When they came here, the first building that was built on the farm was always the barn. And people could live in tents, they could live in the wagons, they could live in the barn if they needed to. But you had a barn. You could contain your livestock. You could collect more manure. And there was a walled, just so high outside the barn where they put the manure, and they would add water to it to help it better. And besides, they used to say you could always tell an Amish or Mennonite farm by the size of the barn, the plainness of their house, and their good fences. That they did better at building fences than most people. Okay. I grew up near Haskins, Iowa, and just outside of Haskins, Iowa, Daniel Mickey had a nursery. And he grew hedge trees. He planted hedge seeds, grew trees, dug up those trees and planted them for fences all around the area. And he sold out every year for year after digging up and planting over 6 million trees a year. And that was when 1 million was a big number. 6 million trees a year. There are almost no hedgerows anymore. Very few. Most have been bulldozed out. Also, you could tell an Amish or Mennonite farm if there was an orchard. Almost always. There would be an orchard from 50 to 150 trees, because that supported the family and also gave something to sell. What was probably, when the first people got here, what was the work animal?
Horse.
Oxen. Why?
Long lives, hard work.
They were hardworking, and you only worked oxen in the morning. So you had the afternoon off. But oxen were much more dependable on the prairie. That there were bogs and things that horses just could not navigate, and oxen could. And we use, like I said, we use oxen just in the morning, and also a yoke of oxen could turn an amount of land in a day. That's where we get the size of an acre. 1 acre was what a yoke of oxen could plow in a morning. And the word acre comes from a dialect in Germany that means oxen. Totally useless information, but you know, I think it's kind of cool. Now, if you don't get this one, you should. What's this?
Ox shoes.
Ox shoes. Oxen needed shoes like horses needed shoes. And you don't find them much anymore. This is a pair, and it's dated 1880, which is pretty late actually. And occasionally I have found some that just turn up in the soil, oxen shoes. But many times I've held these up for a group and they had no idea what they were. But I hadn't just given you the answer in the talking. Also, if you were working with oxen and one of them fell or broke a leg or something, you could eat it. Most people didn't eat horses. They could, and they did, but oxen were, I don't know, made better hamburger. Okay. When they first broke the prairie sod and planted corn, that first year's crop sometimes made 100 bushels to the acre. It was the richest soil in the world. When I was digging the basement under my house, I was still in good, rich, black prairie soil at a depth of 4 feet. There's almost no place in the world that that happens. Anybody recognize this corn?
Indian corn? Indian corn?
Anybody know what that is? This is what your ancestors would have grown in Iowa before the Civil War. It's a dent corn, and it's called Bloody Butcher corn. And this is corn that I've grown. This last year was not a good year. It was very dry, but sometimes those ears can be about this long and maybe 3 on a stalk. And they grow very high. A lot of times I have to pull the stalk down to pick the corn. Last year wasn't that way, but this is Bloody Butcher corn, and it is probably the very first dent corn. Before that, they were just rounded. I have a friend who is no longer living, but he raised cattle in Van Buren County, and he fed them ground old varieties of corn, and they got very sick. And he couldn't understand why. It was too rich for them. He could cut down by 3/4 what he was feeding his cattle, and they still gained weight because the corn was much more nutritious than modern hybrid corn. Now, I brought this, not that any of our ancestors ever did this. This is the oldest form of corn known to exist. It's called pod corn, and each kernel is in its own shuck. Sweet corn would not have been fun. And a lot of times they're red. But this is called pod corn. Nearly became extinct. And I used to raise it, and then I didn't keep seed, and it was almost impossible to find more seed. But it can be very beautiful corn. But each kernel is in its own shuck. Okay, when people came here, and here settling, I'm talking about other settlers, not just Amish and Mennonite. People settled where there were trees because they thought if it didn't grow trees, it wouldn't grow crops. They didn't realize that the prairie soil was the richest in the world. If you go out and I hate to even say this because it's hard to believe, in much of our area, there are more trees here than there were when the settlers came. Even though the timbers are gone, there's more trees. There used to be, if you went from Wellman to Washington, you would not see a single tree. That was before Wellman was there, but there just were no trees. It was prairie. But that soil, like I said, was 4 feet deep, the best soil in the world. But between the English River, except along Crooked Creek, there were no trees. People would settle where there were timbers. And you could tell how thick the timbers were by fences. How could you tell how thick the timber were by fences? Well, that went well too, didn't it? Okay. What is this?
Split rail.
This is a fence rail. Who's most noted for splitting rails? And almost everybody thinks he worked on the railroad. And he did not. Okay, now, I'm just starting to get on some of this. Almost everything up here are tools that the people made. They didn't go to Walmart and buy them. There was no blacksmiths or whatever. Okay, look at this rail. If you had to split that rail, you wanted that tree to have been a straight tree. And what did you split it with? Now, some of you heard me a couple of weeks ago talk. What is this tool?
Wedge.
Wedge is made out of metal.
Wood wedge.
It's a wood wedge. But this, you could make. You needed to make almost all of your tools. And this is what Abraham Lincoln would have split rails with. This is called a glut.
Oh, yeah.
Now, what did you pound a glut with? Another tool that you made yourself. This is a commander. You'd start it in the end of a log and pound it. If it broke, you made another one. Okay, but you don't find many old gluts because they wore out. Here's this one. I like this because that's one piece of wood. You didn't have to worry about the handle coming loose. But this would be working if you were splitting. Okay, now look at how long that piece is. That tree had to be straight grain that long.
With no limbs.
With no limbs. Now, I collect buildings, which I know isn't normal, but you can tell how thick the timbers were by how long the logs are in a log building. One of my log houses, and there are no log cabins in Iowa. There's log houses, but there are no log cabins, not old ones. One of my log houses is 32 by 18. That meant there were trees 32 foot high that were straight, and oak. Now, when I got this log house, this 32, I needed to replace the bottom 2 logs. And the man I got the house from is down by Noble. It was built by Amish people. And I needed 2 logs to replace. And luckily the man that I got the house from said that I could cut logs from the same timber that the original ones were cut from. So I don't know how many acres were in this timber, but quite a few. Guess how many trees I could use out of that timber? I needed 2, and there were 2. No others, because the timber was not thick enough for them to grow straight and tall. So when we talk about Amish and Mennonite fences. They selected good fence rails. And I have a bunch of these. I tore down a barn. You're laughing at me inside, and I'm used to that. I tore down a barn several years ago to get these rails because they were the floor in the haymow. They very much predated that barn, but they saved them and put them in the floor in the haymow. So if you need, I've got a whole bunch of those. Okay. So when they talked about the Amish and Mennonite fences, they built them taller than most people. Most people didn't like to split out the wood. Okay. Like I said, there were just trees along creeks, and then there was a wonderful part of Iowa's history that gets almost no attention, and that's something called a savanna. And a savanna was an area where there was prairie grass and scattered, usually oak trees, often on a hillside, and the grass was not thick enough that when a fire came through that it burned all off. And it might burn, but it wasn't thick enough to kill the trees, because most trees died in a prairie fire. That's why we don't have trees. Not that they don't grow here. The only tree that lives without, or can live through a prairie fire is the bur oak, which I say is our state tree. They just say oak, but I say bur oak. Okay. Okay. What do you call a room in a barn?
A pan.
Technically, we don't use the word much anymore, but a room in a barn is called a bay. And here is a picture, and I'm sure this was made by Amish or Mennonites because I got this picture at Crowded Closet. But there's 4 bays here, one up and one down, you know, on 2 sides. Originally, there would have been a driveway through the center. Then that was closed in. And if you have that with a driveway in the center, that's called a dog trot. Unless you live in the south and they call it a possum trot. But I think a dog trot is a lot better. You just pass that around. But houses were often done that way. And in a log building, you don't have rooms. You have cribs or pens, but you never have rooms. So you could have a 2-pen log house, or, but not a 2-room one. Like I said, the Amish and Mennonites in Europe were largely subsistence farmers. When they got here, they became very well off. And again, a little bit about the nature here. With the hedgerows, there were lots of birds, much more wildlife. And this is a study from the University of Nebraska that I always used when I was teaching. And I'm sure most people don't believe this, but the University of Nebraska, and this was done, I'm not sure of the year on it, they took 2 almost identical 50-acre plots, not beside each other, but with pretty much the same amount of rainfall, same soil and everything. One of them they farmed modern fence row to fence row. The other of the 50 acres, they planted 5 acres of brush and trees around the outside edge. So there were 45 acres to farm. They used no chemicals, no fertilizer on the 45 acres, and raised more than on the 50 acres that had every other benefit. Because there was enough wildlife in those 5 acres around that they ate the weed seeds and the insects. Now, do we do that now? Not very much. I have never in my lifetime seen as many road ditches, fence rows, creek sides, bulldozed of trees as this last year. Just every place, there's less trees by the thousand. We've lost several thousand trees close to our house because we had a dirt road that had trees. They're all gone, every single one of them. Because of habitat reduction and chemical use, the bird population in the United States and Canada since 1970 has dropped over 3 billion. Fewer birds. This community and the Amish and Mennonite help a great deal by encouraging purple martins. That's significant. Most places they spray for mosquitoes. What does that do to you? Okay. The DNR, Department of Natural Resources, have rules that said there should be no roadside mowing until after July 15th, later if possible, to allow for nesting birds. No mowing farther than 200 feet from a house. We have neighbors that mow a half mile from their house with a lawnmower. By law, you're not supposed to be farther than 200 feet. Last year, Washington County started mowing roadsides in May. The state started about the same time. I asked the local office of the DNR to publicize the rules about protecting nesting birds. They didn't know they had rules. They looked and found that they did. But it still has not got in the paper. I've tried, I've written up articles, and it's not ever been used. But I still hope that we can do that. If there's more birds, there's less need for chemicals. Now, I did not bring the original letters. We have them, but I brought copies because they're easier to read. This is a letter written to somebody in Washington County in 1840. Now that's before Amish and Mennonites were here, I realize, but you came soon. Okay, I love this first sentence. You have been so long in writing that Margaret has become uneasy respecting you and has been urging me for the last 2 or 3 weeks to write that we may ascertain whether you are alive or dead, and if alive, whether you are well, and what is the reason for your silence. I have today agreed to comply with her earnest request and have sat down to scribble whilst the rain is falling. That's the first sentence of the letter. Okay. Now, I did not know this occurred until and a man in Illinois sent me these original letters not long ago. And how he knew to send them to me, I don't know, but I was glad he did. The next paragraph says, have you been paying any attention to the progress of the silk business? How many of you knew we had a silk business in Washington and Johnson counties? And he says, I mean raising the worms and manufacturing the silk. And he talks here how he has planted over 1,000 cuttings of mulberry trees. Now, red mulberries are native to Iowa. All other mulberries are not. So probably what the silkworms didn't eat is what's still out there today. Okay. I have planted over 20,000 roots and have 60,000 trees, and they produce upwards of 3 million. They will eventually produce 3 million trees, and I intend feeding this season 90,000 worms. I don't know whether this happened very much, but then it goes on here. Not everything always mathematically fits. But he said, if I planted a tree, the first year it produces a pound of leaves, and each worm eats 1 ounce. Each tree would therefore feed 16 worms. Then 3 million multiplied by 16 would be 48 million trees, or worms. But this is more than we could properly attend to. And he talks about his cocoony, which is the building where they raise the worms, is 26 by 32 feet, and he can house 500,000 worms in there at a time. And eventually he could get up to 2 million. Then he has all of the costs for this. And wages of one woman at $3 a month. Board, $2 a week. Wages of 5 children, 7 to 10 years of age, plus 4 weeks at 1 week each of housing, $20 for all of them. And they unwrapped the silkworms. And he's got here how much that got, how many yards it was, and he could make $1,333 $33 and a third cents the first year.
Now, where was
In
this at?
Washington County, Iowa.
Washington County.
$1,333.33 and 1/3 would have been a fortune in 1840. Nobody would have been making that kind of money. And then he was hoping to get even more millions of worms. Now, I had never, until these letters came to me, had any idea that we did silkworms here. But anyway, interesting. So maybe you should get some worms and feed those mulberry trees to them. If you remember when we were talking in Europe, one of the crops that they rotated with was flax. We used to grow flax here in Washington and Johnson counties. And what did you do with flax? Linen. And I brought a couple coverlets here, and I think one of them is either the warp or the wolf is linen, and the other is wool. Okay, so you harvested the linen, and I have a picture of a lady with a bunch of linen, and I didn't find it. But you take the linen, throw it in a creek, and let it rot. Then you bring it up, and you take a flax breaker. And I have a flax breaker, but it's big, and I didn't bring it. That you would go down and break the stalks, then you get the fibers out, and you would take it to a linen spinner, and the closest around here was Van Buren County, and they spun linen and made flax. And it was done all over Iowa, and probably less here than other places, because we considered our ground too valuable for flax. And I thought I should, and maybe you aren't interested in this, so don't listen if you're not. What is agriculture like today? We talked about it pre-Civil War-ish. Average size of farm in Washington County is 275 acres. Johnson County, 242 acres. So very similar. Now, the closest census we have is 2017. The next one comes out this summer. So this will be updated then. Cropland in Washington County is 85% of the land use. 87% in Johnson. And it's got no-till and all of that here. Okay. Washington County, we rank 3rd out of 99 counties on livestock and poultry products, of all 99. We rank 1st in hogs in Washington County. Now, if you live in Washington County and you take care of your share of the hogs raised in Washington County, you need to personally take care of 62 hogs. You are outnumbered 62 to 1. Now, maybe that'll change with California not wanting to eat our pork, but anyway, 62 to 1. We are by far the leading county in Iowa for hogs. Johnson County is 66th in hogs. Washington County is 3rd in sheep and goats. Johnson County is 2nd out of the 99 counties. More goats, dairy goats, are raised in this area around Kelowna than any other place in the United States. If you get goat cheese anywhere in the United States, it started in Kelowna, Iowa, almost 100% sure. Now, we should have a factory here for that, but we don't. Okay, and the county extension was wonderful and ran off way more information than I needed, but it's interesting to look at. I'll talk about some of the things I brought here, but I want to close the talking part of it here with another passage by David Klein. Of visiting a secluded wood in the spring. The wind is in the trees and the water flowing over the shale-bottomed creek seems to whisper, "Do not come closer. Take off your gumboots because you are standing on holy ground." So I did. All of us need to treat Iowa soil as holy ground. Thank you. Then I'll talk about these things a little bit. Is that okay?
You're going to talk about it now?
Well, it's better than tomorrow. Okay, I'll do this quickly.
Take your time.
Okay. So, what was this? A glut. Good. Use that word. That's a neat word. Okay. One of the things that the Amish and Mennonite did was make better varieties of cattle. What are these? You put it on the horns so that it grows down. They're horn weights. And it works. The horns grow down and they're not a danger. And this was particularly used on milk cows that you had a relationship with. Some of you probably know what this is. And now notice almost everything up here is something you could make. Because you had to. Maybe Howard knows what this is. If you work a horse too much, it lathers up, and this is to scrape the sweat off of a horse.
They make them in stainless now.
Well, this is stainless. Okay. I don't know what order I want to go here. There were, when people came here, if they didn't bring this with them, it was hard for them to do anything. You had to bring a blacksmith-made axe. This is a broad axe. I have several of these, and this is what you needed to build your house. Now, there was one other tool that you could use to build your house, and I'll show you that here. No, I shouldn't do this, but... Our son Adam and I used to do programs for schools about Abraham Lincoln, and I did a lot of research on Abraham Lincoln. And he only showed off one time, or doing one thing. And I don't know whether I can still do this or not. I can. It is heavy. I don't want any of you to try it because blood rusts it. But that's a broadaxe. Here is a buzzard wing broadaxe. And broadaxes were right-handed or left-handed. And how you changed them? This is a right-handed buzzard wing axe. If I took the handle out and put it in the other side, it would be a left-handed. And you worked with an axe, you hewed the log. Notice the curve in the handle?
Yeah.
That is because if you are working a log, you chop right next to your leg. You want the handle to be bent so that it doesn't hit your leg. But that's how you hew. You walk along and hew. And when I redid the log house that I had to put in 2 new logs, I was the best person in Washington County at hewing logs.
Probably the only one.
Didn't it sound better when I said it? But you got to be pretty good, but I wasn't near what people would have been when they started. Okay. Here's an axe that obviously was not made locally, had to be brought here.
You sure that's not a comb?
A comb. You know, maybe that's why. Nobody knows?
Flash comb?
It's pretty heavy. It's pretty heavy. This is for hewing stones for your foundation. And you wanted a foundation because you didn't want to put logs right on the ground. Although a lot of times people did put logs right on the ground. Okay. Here's a tool. Again, you would have had to bring this with you if you came early. And this is how you use it. What's it called? A froe. And you don't use this, but to and fro, to and fro, to and fro. We still use that. And sometimes you've maybe heard people say, dull as a hoe. It's dull as a froe. This isn't sharp. And this is what you split shingles, or if you had a piece that was straight grain, you cut siding with this. But it had to be straight grain. I brought this, had a bumper crop of this last year, and this is, if you lived back in Pilgrim days, this would have been your pumpkin pie. And Julie did this year. We cut the top out, took the seeds out, and put in a custard, baked it, and then when you take it out, you take a little bit of the meat of this, and that's a pie with no crust. And we had a bunch of those this year. Okay. It's what?
A nice night.
Okay, what's a noisemaker for? Noise.
Calling the cattle.
In the fall, when you were picking corn, there were large flocks of crows. And you would send one of your kids out in the field and swing this over their heads to keep the crows out. It's called a horse fiddle. And it's all wood. It's something you could have made. It's entirely wood. And I have another one. It's a little bit bigger. And it's older. That one was used to all hands on deck on boats during the Revolutionary War. But this was used for cornfields around here. Okay. Here's another example of using wood. That's one piece. Isn't that neat? I wonder how many times they walked through looking for something that would. This is a spoon auger. This is what you would drill with before they had augers. And this is hard, drilling into the end of a log to put in a wood peg, but this is what was used. Now this one, you probably, all of you wouldn't have had one of these, but you knew who in the neighborhood did. And you can see all parts of it. This moves. If you had a horse or a cow or a child with a bad tooth, You went to the neighbor that had one of these, you hooked it around that tooth, and it just pops right out. But if you had a cow or a horse with a bad tooth, they're not going to do well, and a child's going to be disagreeable, and this just pops that tooth right out. So I still have this. If you know, dentists are very, very expensive. And this is what? Pitchfork.
That's cool.
It's made out of one piece of wood. And it grew this way. And they used to, and I don't know for sure, and I'll have to hunt up, but there's a certain kind of tree that this is the root system. So this would have been below ground. And so you would go out and raise those trees and make pitchforks.
You don't know what kind of wood it is?
I don't, and I could make it up, but maybe it was mulberry that the worms didn't eat. All wood.
Is that a butter churn? Butter churn?
And it is a butter churn. And it was probably for a woman who was rocking a baby. She could rock this with her feet and make butter at the same time. Here's a larger,
She can multitask.
yes. And with two of them, she could have multitask. Here's a broad axe that was found. As you can see, it's all pitted. But just lift some of those. This one here, you know what this is, and I don't have it set up because I wasn't going to do it, but this hooks on here. It's a flail. You would get your grain, lay it down, and then beat it with this. And they used it in Bible times. And when we were in Ethiopia, we saw people still using this. Now we talked about flax. After you let it rot, this is what you straighten the fibers with. It's called a hatchel. Here's a pitchfork that is above the ground, but it just has two tines. Okay. And you know what this is. It's a corn planter. And it still has all the instructions back here. And you would go and then some of them, and I have one but I didn't bring it, that has an attachment on the back. About every 10th heel, you hit that and that planted a pumpkin seed. Which was important for you to live through the winter. Okay. These do the same thing. I just like them. They're wood. Again, you could make them. Okay. Julie's family had members that did sorghum. And this is what you would strip the cane with. It's not heavy, so you'd cut the leaves off the cane before it frosted and let it stand, and you cut it later. And this was the one that was in Julie's family, and then we found out later that her family bought all of their sorghum making equipment from my family, the Woodsteins at Daytonville. And so then they gave me this one. So this is real prize for me. Okay, we're about done. These do the same thing.
Bunch of hole to put a seed in.
You could bury a seed.
Yeah.
Nobody knows? And anymore, if I say what it's for, a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about. And people don't know what shocks are anymore. But you would cut corn, lay it down, and I've got a bunch of different kinds of this. But this one, you'd lay the rope down, lay the corn on it, and then stand it up and stick this in there and tighten the rope. And this one, you would just stick it in there and tighten it up. And it's not a one-person job. But that you would take to make your shock, that you would take and move to the top bay of your barn to feed the stock in the wintertime. Okay. Oh.
Back scratcher.
You have a serious problem. You could wash clothes if you just had skinny clothes. But again, this is something you could make. And that was so important. And it's so hard to find original things that you could make. Because they wore out. This is a corn sheller. And it works. And if you got it worn down, you made a new one. Okay, we're about done. And I was talking with some of you earlier. How many have ever worn a pair of gloves like this? And what'd you use them primarily for?
Husking corn.
Husking corn. So when you wore this thumb out, you wore it on the other.
It's sold out now still.
You can still get these. Okay. And I passed. Okay, where? I just had it in my hand. Okay. Here.
That little piece.
Hang your gloves on. Hang your gloves on.
This is to dry your wet gloves. And it's shaped to fit your glove. And then this fits the thumb. So that you can dry your mittens. Isn't that a neat thing? I think that's neat.
Well, what is this?
You could make that.
You could make that. Okay, just a real quick ending. I've been working for the county since COVID to find cemeteries in our county. And they had records of about 45, and we are now at over 360 cemeteries in the county. And Vance Bolton, who's a DNR biologist, and I did Lake Darling, and he put this book together. There are 78 cemeteries on the ground at Lake Darling. And we haven't gone over all the ground yet. But we mapped every house, every barn, every cemetery. There's over 300 adults buried there and 80-some children that are buried there.
Unmarked?
There's one cemetery that has about 4 stones, and the rest of them are not marked. And I use these. These are highly technical instruments. They only just look like they used to be coat hangers. But it works. And you can laugh, but I can drive down the road and I say, there's some people buried back there. And I stop and get out and walk out in the field, and I've never yet not found graves. Oh, here's one more. Here's a traveler, if you know what a traveler is. And this is a wood one. Mostly they're metal. Okay, talk too much.
Wait, what's the traveler?
Traveler is to measure the outside of a wheel to cut the tire for. And the tire was metal. Any questions?
Michael.
Question, the corn,
Butcher.
Bloody butcher.
Yeah. Did only animals eat that, or
Oh,
did people eat
You,
that?
you could grind it for people too. You want some?
Early in your talk, you talked about the Mennonites and the Amish going to Sweden.
Switzerland.
Switzerland. Going to Switzerland, and they use lime and,
Gypsum.
who thought of that? Who was the brain that said, let's put some lime on this field?
Well,
Who would have thought of something like that?
I don't know. And as far as I could find, there was no records as to who thought of that. And I suppose that if they got to some marginal land in Switzerland, maybe there was somebody there that had found out. Or there could have been just some gypsum there that, well, it grows better by this, you know?
I have an idea.
Okay,
They would have used it to whitewash their houses, their stone part, and if they threw it out and the grass grew better there, they noticed.
yeah, probably.
Jay, you're always so smart.
Anything else? Yes?
I was wondering, in Switzerland, were the barns kept immaculate, because wasn't it a house barn
Sometimes,
often?
sometimes it
And so
was.
you wouldn't want that manure smell coming into your house.
And I borrowed this, we used to have it when I was on the farm, but I borrowed this. What am I?
A farmer.
This time of year, especially. You walk out in the field, there you are, a manure spreader. You would load this up from the reservoir by your barn and hand carry it out to your fields. And wouldn't you be excited about February and March coming? But that's, and they wouldn't have metal, they would have had a wood one. But we used to have these when I was on the farm, so I borrowed this one. Okay,
Where did the corn come from?
I grew it.
No, but I mean, back then.
There was not corn in Europe, but it was, the Native Americans had it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Different varieties came from the Native Americans.
Yes,
Didn't the Indians introduce the corn to the Pilgrims?
yeah, corn is native to the New World. And I think maybe most pumpkins are too,
And potatoes.
and potatoes. And tomatoes.
Were there any sod houses?
I don't know about Johnson County. There were sod houses in Washington County. In the very western part of the county, there were no trees, and they did have some sod houses southwest of Wellman. You know, it was before Wellman was there.
We recently visited, what is it, the Neil Smith?
Neil Smith Wildlife.
Yeah, and it just had the prairie grasses, and then it showed its root system, and then just how difficult that would have been to dig
Indeed.
up. It
Well-
was very, very tight and,
I take care of cemeteries. This will be my 60th year of taking care of cemeteries. And one of those, there are burials from the 1840s. And I don't know when it was started to be moved, certainly not right away, but it was mowed. I mowed it 60 years, and it's been mowed long before that. And I decided, what's going to happen if I don't mow part of this? The prairie grass came back the first year. When they did the Neil Smith Wildlife Area, that had been farmed for, I think, 130 years. And they quit farming it, and there were prairie plants that came back that first year. They just wait. And prairie grasses can put their roots down maybe 40 feet.
yeah, it
And what's Iowa state flower?
was wild rose.
Puts its roots down as far as 60 feet, and it grows this tall. They never know when it's a drought.
I have an old book that was written by one of my great uncles, who was came to Iowa in the early 1830s, late 30s, 40. Came into Henry County, especially down around the Salem area where I grew up. They plowed the prairie grass, and in the book he says it gave off some kind of a gas that made people sick.
They thought it was gas coming from the prairie, and what it was is they were plowing through wet areas, and it was, what they thought was gas was the result of mosquitoes. It was called fever and ague, and a lot of people died from the fever and ague. And it wasn't gas, it was just the result of disturbing the swampy areas.
I just read a section of it the other day, and he talked about in there that no one died from this, but they got extremely sick. So I don't know if it's the same thing.
There were people that died, and they were lucky if they didn't, but
The fever and ague was caused by malaria.
mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Okay, I talked too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. He didn't talk too long, it was just right. We thank you all for coming. We do have refreshments available and some beverages, so you can take a little time and enjoy them and mingle and talk to each other and talk to Michael, ask him more questions. Could you demonstrate what happens when you walk with those wires?
Well, do you want to know if there's somebody buried under your room here? This has nothing to do with burials. It has only to do with digging. Disturbing the magnetic field by digging. And how many have ever been on Highway 218 and the intersection at Mount Pleasant, 218 and 34? It's a real weird intersection. Our son and I planned that intersection. I had a call from the Department of Transportation. They said, we've got a problem. We bought a farm many, many years ago anticipating putting that intersection on that farm. Then we found there are 2 cemeteries on the farm. Now, we can hire somebody to come with a bulldozer and take 3 inches off of 160 acres, or you can come, and they always say that they don't believe in this, but they paid me. And so we went down, and if you go over where the ground has been dug, the wires do that. And I didn't do that. So there's a drain or something right below me. But anybody can do it. It's even biblical. And see, there's a drain or something that goes through there. But this is how I find graves. And you don't dig a grave bigger than you need it, so you can tell if it's a child or an adult.
Well, and most people back in the long ago, they would bury relatives by their house. So that's why I think we have so many burials around here. All these old homesteads and places just have burials.
There were many burials at home before the Civil War, and then again during the Depression.
We have 8 over by our garden, and there was an area where it was always goes down, and we're thinking maybe the box kind of.
If there was a box, but.
Yeah. But I've been more in the cemetery.
So, anything else? Well, come up and look and ask questions, and if you want to look at the book about Lake Darling, you can, and do things to preserve birds.
Can you show us how you said the black space?
Shut her off. I gotta just shut it off.